Now we're going to move into an area that I'm going to find fascinating from the standpoint of, all right, we've got all this data now. We've got all this information. We're in a position to know more about consumers. And the further we get with knowing about consumers, the more questions are going to be in the future. So we want to talk about a controversial topic: human and digital intersectionality, a moral dilemma, or not. All right? So what I'd like to do is have Mylene come up. She's our moderator for this panel. She's from Collins Community Credit Union. Welcome. Raj, where are you? My partner in crime in putting this together, from Connected Federal Credit Union. Stephen Bohannon, who planted the seed with me on this topic. And Ton Lane, who is from Cal Coast Credit Union. And he's been willing to have a cocktail here and there with me to really go into detail on these subjects. So please welcome them to talk about, and let me just set the stage, to talk about buy now, pay later. All right? Credit unions are focused right now on the concept of member well-being. We want, as Jeff indicated, the whole self. We want to help. And yet, we see transactions, much like we did during the days of elder abuse, when we knew this was leading to a problem. And so, without going on a political journey here, what I want to be able to do is say, what if we know that these transactions are leading to behaviors, whether it's crypto, sports betting? We found out some data here in Las Vegas that the #1 day for sex trafficking was Super Bowl through our data. All right? One of the fastest growing buy now, pay later is actually shoot now, pay later. And it's being generated by a fintech. Now, we have income, all right? The question that I want our group to explore is, as a governance, at a governance level, and also for us from a kind of inquiring minds, is how do we start to look at that? Or is it none of our business? I'll leave you to it, Mylene.
So what I'm going to do first is really focus on the mental health piece. And then I'm going to let our panelists really talk about what does that really mean. So mental health, is it mainstream or taboo? It's a little bit of both still. Mainstream as in we're talking about it more readily since COVID. You know, top executives have come out to say, yes, this is important. We need to think about mental well-being as well. I may have some issues dealing with depression and anxiety. So we've started talking about it. But where the taboo piece is the action. Have we done anything about it? In my recollection, really, not really. So we keep everything at arm's length. We recognize there are issues, so we can talk about it now. But still, there's not enough being done to combat it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the numbers. I'm in marketing, so I like to do fuzzy numbers. So to set the stage, so we have, according to the last census, 330 million Americans. More than half are credit union members. Now let's set that aside. Recent Yale Law study about inclusive digital banking had said over 43 million Americans suffer through a mental issue annually. NIH similarly said that people suffering from depression and anxiety are 3 times as more likely to be in debt. So that equals financial instability. What does that mean for our future as a society? Not looking very bright. Take that into consideration. So let's do the math, the 43 million Americans. Let's scale that down to credit unions. Let's say 20 million credit union members suffer a mental health issue annually. That means 1 in 6 credit union members have a mental health issue. That's a lot of people that we're serving that we may not be doing anything for. And if we know information, what is our responsibility to our members? Are we actually people helping people? Are we helping ourselves, trying to be sustainable? So really the question is, take some scenarios before I pass it off. Let's take romance scams out there. We have actually a former board member's wife that is the next door neighbor of my CEO. So she talks to her, trash can talk, I say. They go pick up their trash cans, have a conversation, and she recognized that there may be issues happening. So what did she do? Her position as CEO, well, let me take a look at what she's doing. And she did find some inconsistencies. So what she did was halt them and have a conversation. But still, ultimately, 80% of the time, the member still makes the decision. Let it go. I believe in this. So what do we do as a credit union? Do we take that next step? Do we take it to the authorities? Do we take it to DHS? Now, those things take time and resources that most credit unions don't have today. But can we willingly let this go on? And this could be applied to any scenario, not just romance scams. So I'll pass it off.
Okay. All right. Well, that was a plethora of use cases out there, right? So let's try to tackle it, what's in our control versus what's not, right? So as a financial institution, of course, you're dealing with data. I mean, you have data, and the data tells you a story, right? So based on transaction history, you can pretty much, you can nail it to the point where you know exactly what a person is interested in, does in her or his daily lives, all of their hobbies, pretty much all of their actions, behaviors. You can predict pretty much anything and everything, almost everything. But as an institution, you only have a sliver of that information, right? Sometimes the data gets fuzzy because you don't have the full picture, right? You only have a sliver of that information. So what that means is, however, as a consumer, you are transacting across multiple financial institutions or multiple retail institutions. So you need that broader aspect of all of the transactions put together to paint a picture, right? So to your point, I might have some data that says he or she is suffering from mental health issues or financial distress, or maybe a romance scam, maybe maybe a sex trafficking, getting sex trafficked. But that's just a sliver of information. So how do you piece all of that information together to paint the picture, right? So that's where you need more of a governing body or a governing entity that has access to information from all of the different sources, and they're able to correlate all of that information, hopefully in real time, and make an actionable decision, or make it actionable with law enforcement or whichever governing body or whoever, right? The danger is making a decision based on that sliver of information that we as an institution have. Sometimes you might be right, but sometimes you might be wrong, right? So that's where you need to have data from all of the multiple sources to make that decision.
Yes, I agree. In fact, because that data is there. In fact, Raj, I brought yours. And I thought we would, just so everyone knows what you're into. Just kidding. No, you're exactly right. In fact, you may know Alchemy just bought a company called Segment a few months ago, and it is spooky what you're able to derive about someone based upon all their financial account information. We can tell whether or not you like to vacation, whether or not when you vacation you're a timeshare owner, or whether or not you like to go and stay in hotels. We can tell if you're a golfer. We can tell if you're a parent or a grandparent or getting ready to be one of those things. And we use it for marketing really well, right? But that same information can be used to be early warning signs of this. But I think what you're bringing up, you're bringing out the inherent problem that can exist with maybe not having a complete picture of it. But let's just assume, for the sake of the argument, that we did have a complete picture of it, that we knew this was the primary transacting account. And so we said, you can assume you've got 100% of the information. Then the question is, do you do anything? Do you have a responsibility to do anything? We are in Sin City, of course. I know, sorry for the people that live here, to call it that, but we're in Vegas. Lots of vices available here. I think, if you, correct me if I'm wrong, of course, this is everywhere in the country. You drink too much, the bartender has a responsibility to pull back the drink, right? Not serve you anymore. Here in Vegas, if they feel as though you are gambling more than you can lose, they'll literally stop you, come back, talk to you. You sure you can afford this? So, because they ultimately don't want you to run your life, right? They want you to keep coming back, and they want this to be a lifetime thing, not something that makes you. There's a reason why for many, many years none of these hotels had balconies on them, right? There is. There's absolute reason behind that. So we see even in this industry where they feel like some in the vice industry, there's a certain responsibility to when I notice things that could be destructive to people's personal lives, I'm going to step in, or at least I'm going to be able to hit the pause button for a little bit. So then we kind of bring that over to us, who actually has a lot more data than what the bartender would have or what the pit boss would have. And we'd say, what responsibility do we have to look at this? All of a sudden, I can see a person's, for instance, one of the things we can do is we can absolutely look and see what your income is. And then I can tell you what percentage of your income you're spending on sports betting, what percentage of your income you're spending on other, whether it be gambling, pornography, any other sort of kind of vice. And I can say, whoa, like this person, and this person's bouncing checks for their mortgage or their rent or whatever. Like, that's a problem, right? So I think that first, I definitely want to get into like how you would actually do it, the governance around it and all that. But I think the first question we should ask is, should we even? Or is it really kind of see no evil, hear no evil, and just kind of go about our daily business? And our job is to facilitate and to assume that we don't know the whole story. Therefore, it absolves us of responsibility.
So before I get to talking about this topic, I have to address Sue's comment in introduction about sharing cocktails. Oftentimes here in Vegas, they never, pulled back. The bartenders continue to serve. So we never got to that point. But when I got the email, like many of you, to speak at this session, I was looking at the topics and I'm like, what? I didn't understand that. The human and digital intersectionality. I had to look up the word intersectionality, and then I called Sue and Zach and said, what are we talking about here? And I think we were on the phone for an hour and a half, and I will tell you, being on the phone with Sue is like therapy for me. So thank you for that, Sue. So I'm going to take a little bit of a different twist on this, and because I do think we have a responsibility. That's my bottom line. I'm not going to talk about mental health. I'm going to talk about economic abuse and financial coercion related to something that's very close to me, and I'll explain why that's the case. But economic abuse and financial coercion related to those victims of domestic violence, human trafficking, and those that grow up in the foster care system. And I think we all can learn something about that today. I continue to learn about the foster care system, and I'll share a story with you about that and the financial coercion that takes place there. You wouldn't think it would, but it does. So I'm not an expert in this. I will admit that. I happen to be married to a wonderful lady who works in this space, though. She's a politician, but she also runs a foundation that assists primarily women and children that are fleeing domestic violence. And never thought there was a financial component to it, a financial coercion component to it, but there is. And it often ends up turning into homelessness. She's gotten involved with human trafficking. The stories are just tragic that I get to hear on a nightly basis, and foster care as well. So for me, and I think the title says a moral dilemma, there's not a question mark there. It's not a moral dilemma. It's a moral imperative. It's a moral imperative that we get involved. Now, economic abuse in domestic violence, human trafficking, and foster care leads to many things. I think we know what they are. A poor credit history, financial instability, leaves them vulnerable to collectors and collection agencies. It oftentimes forces them into bankruptcy. And the long-term consequences are huge in terms of their ability to get education, housing, and employment. So again, the long-term effects are significant. So I believe that credit unions should play a role in the identification, now whether it's through data or what we do today in our branches and call center, but we do have a role in the identification, prevention, and recovery of victims of human trafficking, domestic violence, and those that grow up in the foster care system. And I find it quite ironic that we are required, you all are required to do elder abuse training on an annual basis, but you are not required to do any training on domestic violence, identifying those that are domestic violence, financial coercion. It seems ironic to me that we're not. And I think it's wrong. Now, there has been legislation proposed. Our credit unions in the state of California or in San Diego, there has been numerous bill after bill after bill in our state legislature that has tried to take various runs at it, and there's been some success, and it's very recent. I'll share a little bit about that, but it's mostly failed. And it's mostly failed because guess who opposes it? We do. Credit unions do. Banks do. We don't want to have to deal with it. We don't want the obligation in that space. And in my opinion, we ought to be working with our legislatures to find some common ground here, to figure out what our role is, again, in identifying, preventing, and repairing. There was a bill recently that was proposed in the state of California to simply provide voluntary training to financial institutions on how to identify victims of domestic violence as it relates to financial coercion. We're not fixing the world, we're dealing with one section of it. It was voluntary training, voluntary, it wasn't required. And our concern as an industry, and I understand the arguments on both sides of the issue, but our concern was if it's voluntary today, it's going to be mandated tomorrow. Therefore, we oppose. I'm not sure that's the right approach. Now, there has been some success, especially in the state of California. There was a Senate Bill 975. You could look it up. I'm hopeful that it will carry forward into other states, that other states will look at it and perhaps adopt something similar. And Senate Bill 975, which passed the state legislature and was signed by the governor of California, begins early in 2023, provides for the recovery from some victims of financial coercion. And when I say recovery, it's financial recovery. They're not getting money back, but they're left out of the collection efforts if they can prove in a non-judicial manner, so it's not, the courts are not involved, but if they can prove that they were coerced into that debt, then they can't be collected upon, it won't show up on their credit report, and I think that's a great thing. But guess what? We as an industry work to narrow that, and it only includes unsecured debt. Secured debt was left out. So we can continue as credit unions to collect upon and cause those long-term damages that I talked about in terms of education and housing and their credit score, but we can collect on any secured debt from a victim of financial coercion. So this is something that concerns me. I think we need to work on that. So a little bit about what CalCoast has done. Our credit union, as I mentioned, is based in San Diego. We see these issues, San Diego's a border community, border town. We also serve Riverside County, so we see a lot of human trafficking. Domestic violence is out there. It picked up during the pandemic. It was behind walls quite often. But again, through my spouse and her work in that space, it is growing. Domestic violence is growing, and the financial coercion that's going along with it. So absent education, absent the sort of legislation behind an effort to help this, we have decided to get involved, and our role has been, we've had a couple of different sort of attempts, not attempts, we're actually doing it. We are doing financial education for those that have fled domestic violence, those that were somehow escaped human trafficking. It's not just sex trafficking, it's also a modern day form of slavery, quite honestly. And foster youth that have been damaged. So we are doing financial education for all three of those groups, and we've partnered with not-for-profits in the San Diego region that serve those individuals. And we also did something I think that was very beneficial and unique, and it's specific to those victims, again, of any of those three categories. They need transportation. Oftentimes, like domestic violence, they're fleeing in the middle of the night. The person who's perpetrating the domestic violence is not going to let them take the automobile. They're literally on the streets. And we are working with our third-party auto buying service to get them transportation, reasonable transportation at cost. No margins for the car buying service. It's New Cars Inc. It's based in San Diego. So those are some of the things that we are doing, but we are, again, very much interested in collectively advocating for them and for helping them get back on their feet.
Thanks, Todd. So you talk about that it's imperative to do something. And all of us talked about the data that is available. Now, side story, for those that don't know, I lived part of the year in Singapore. And why this really resonates is because when we talk about data, everybody talks about privacy. I want the right to my privacy. But as marketers, we love the data because we need to be targeted so we don't waste all of our money. So just taking a look at, when I say we, I mean Americans, they are very guarded with their privacy. I mean, when we have vaccine and immunization records, to create a national registry here was impossible because people wanted their right to privacy there. But in Singapore, pretty much you give up your right to privacy. And it's because they live a very different life over there. It's very safe. My 10-year-old walks 15, 20 minutes by herself downtown. You see hordes of 8 to 12-year-olds out and about in the mall. Here, I would never allow that to happen because of trafficking situations and things like that. So at what point, how far can we take this thing when we talk about privacy?
I'll take a stab at it, right? So I totally agree with what Steve and Todd were talking about, right? It's a moral imperative. If you know the data, if you understand what's going on, we need to say something about it, talk about it, or report it. But that reporting aspect needs to be, you have to tackle the privacy aspect, right? So just like we take freedoms for granted, we also take privacy pretty serious, right? So data privacy is critical. To me, it is important. Maybe my daughter, not as much. She doesn't care what she puts up on social media. But hey, there's a generation, there are several generations that we do care about data privacy. Having said that, so now it's a three-legged stool, right? So how do you take the data that you have, the intelligence that you glean out of that data, you're identifying distress, you're identifying unusual activity, or whatever the case might be. Now, how do you take that data, maintain data privacy, maintain the separation so that you're not making a bad decision, right? You create that separation and you report up that data to some authority, whatever that governing body is or regulatory agency is, and then you do your part from a reporting standpoint, and then you expect that governing body to act on it, right? So in that sense, hey, as a credit union, I'm at least doing my part by reporting the issue. Hey, I'm providing you all of the information, I'm giving all the data to the agency, and now the agency should have responsibility of saying, okay, Connecta provided this data about this member. Let them validate it. Let them ascertain that whatever I provided to them is actually accurate. Let them bounce it against other databases, other sources of data, and complete the investigation and act on it, right? So they'll know who they need to report to or how the law enforcement gets engaged and act on it. So that way, we are doing our part from a social consciousness standpoint, from a moral obligation standpoint. We are giving them all the data we need. Hopefully, we can get better over time by providing that data in real time, right? So our systems are not such that, today we provide data that's, maybe a day or two old, right? So sometimes the perpetrators have already committed the crime and gone, right? So we need to get to the point where the regulatory agencies that are creating that separation between the financial institutions then get that data in real time, act on it in real time, and stop crime in real time, right? So hopefully we get to that. But this way, I think we do our part. The regulatory agencies, that structure is already in place through USA Patriot Act. It's already there. We already provide them data. It may not be great today, but it needs to get better with time. And more use cases need to be identified in real time. That's where the fintechs come in, right? So we use fintechs to provide this data to FinCEN, let's say, right? We provide data to FinCEN pretty much every day. But the use cases are the same old, right? Hey, fraud, loan fraud, or this fraud, or structuring, or money laundering, or these are all traditional use cases. But the problems we're talking about with human trafficking, or elder abuse, or romance scams, these are all new age things, or mental health, or gun violence. These are the gray area type issues, right? So, but there are data elements that you can provide that can predict some of these use cases. How do you provide this data, right, in a responsible manner while maintaining data privacy? And from a credit union standpoint, we've still done our job, right? And that's the challenge.
Just for the record, I didn't go on record saying that I was for this specifically. I just brought it up as a topic. I think it's very clear, obviously, if it's something that has to do with legality, that's clear cut. We're talking about, as you said, a grayer area, which is more, it's like the same responsibility. I remember, this is like when I was like a teenager, I remember bouncing my first check at Tinker Federal Credit Union. And I think back at the time it was $15, $18. It was a lot of money to have that kind of a fee. And I remember calling them and begging for forgiveness. And they're like, we can't forgive you, but we can reverse that if you come in and we actually take you through how to balance your checkbook course. And if you demonstrate and you kind of go through and take the test or whatever, then at that point we'll credit it back. So I was like, okay, so you'll teach me how to not do this in the future, and in exchange, that's, to me, that was my earliest memory of what made a credit union different than a bank. Was that they were there to actually help me, and if I wanted to help myself. So it's that same spirit that kind of comes into this thing, right? It's not a legal question. It kind of gets into the moral side of things, but you're exactly right, where then you get into the privacy side, right? Because in order for you to be able to help me, you have to kind of invade my privacy a little bit, right? You have to kind of look into a few things that maybe you have no business connecting those dots. And so how dare you connect those dots on me, right? So you have to be willing to be kind of bold in that area in order to actually make that happen. So like one thing I was just thinking about as you were speaking was, what if there was something that was it was kind of sly? Like, okay, I've identified through these algorithms and stuff, this person's got a big gambling problem. I can tell it because I can tell how much money's coming in their account, how much is going out, they keep chasing. maybe I don't call them and say, by the way, you've tripped our Gamblers Anonymous, but maybe all of a sudden there's a piece of content that shows up and saying, hey, did you know that we sponsor with whatever? And it's just in a rolling reel that they don't know that they're a select few group of people that are getting that particular ad. Just same thing we do with other kind of marketing, right? So there are some ways you could be kind of sly where you're like, and you're talking about the domestic support or domestic violence things and things like that. There could be ways that you bring awareness to a certain select group of members without it, like the jig is up, like we've been looking at your data and we've identified that you're having a problem. So there could be some ways you could do it that way, but I'm not settled on this topic. I think privacy is really, really important, and it's really difficult to help someone without invading their privacy a bit. So
Totally agree, but again, when it comes to elder abuse and elder dependent care abuse, we are mandated to report that. And we report it to, I think it's FinCEN, and they take it from there. They do the investigation using other data sources. So I believe they ought to expand the list from just elder financial abuse. And there are other ways I think, to tackle this. And as I was hearing these comments, I was thinking back to the Great Recession, and a lot of us had, not a lot of us, every credit union in the room had members that had a lot of financial stress during the Great Recession. And I remember I started at CalCoast in 2009. The very first meeting I was in, we were sitting down going through members that had requested loan modifications. We were going through their checking account. Not with them present, but we profess to be all about financial wellness. This is a part of financial wellness. We can't extract this part of it. But we were sitting down looking through their checking account to figure out how to do a loan modification that was appropriate for that member. We didn't invite them into the discussion until later on, until we thought we had a solution that they could live with and that we could live with. I just don't see a difference here.
Here's the difference there, right? Is that they were requesting the loan modification. They invited you. This is a little different because you're talking about proactively or even just from algorithmically monitoring things. So I think that is, I totally agree with you. If someone asks you to change the loan, okay, we need to go see your spending patterns. We need to see if you're being responsible. But if they don't ask you for anything and you're kind of, quote, sticking your nose in their business in a sense, and by the way, I don't disagree with a lot of what you're saying, but I am playing the devil's advocate here. It's a tough one. It's really a tough one because ultimately your job is to help them. And it's almost like if I can see it and I know you have a problem, am I, in essence, facilitating that, or am I ultimately being callous by not offering help proactively? It feels weird, right? It feels weird to not help whenever you know you can.
Absolutely. I believe we ought to help proactively. But the alternative to that scenario I was saying is we simply lob it over to collections. And nothing, well, good things happen in collections, but for many people, hopefully I didn't offend anybody.
It sounds like a poster on his wall. Is it good things happen in collections?
Nothing good for the member happens in collection. Now, we help our members, certainly, but again, I don't know exactly what the solution is, certainly relating to the privacy issue, but I think it's a moral imperative. So.
For me, right, so I live in Las Vegas, and like Sue, if you look at my transactions, it's probably all around these casinos and yeah, right. So everywhere, right? So if you
blackjack, really,
yeah, exactly. So if you really start profiling me, I'll probably show up in Steve's Gamblers Anonymous list, right? But that's so far from the truth. So there lies the danger of misinterpreting the data, right? So you need to paint the full picture.
Well, here's the other slippery slope. I'll just give you all. Whenever Roe v. Wade was overturned, we had to get together. We were basically pre-prepping for potential press reaching out because we do have a lot of data and transaction data because there was some talk around leveraging transaction and spending patterns to find people who were now, quote, breaking the law by seeking out, basically female healthcare services. And it's like, could they subpoena us for that information? Like, because we're well, look, we cleanse these transactions. We know what they're being used for, even regardless of what the verbose debit string says. We know that was for this kind of clinic or this type of medicine or whatever, right? So there's a slippery slope that it gets into then as well. Once you kind of start monitoring to seeing what's going on with the intention of helping, but then all of a sudden now you have access to that data, and now it's no different. I mean, look at the cell phone companies. Look at. Do you remember the whole big blow up with Apple years ago, where the feds wanted them to help them crack into phones, right? Because I know the data is there, and you need to help me as a technology company get to that data. So the slippery slope is when you start doing it for the purposes, albeit good things, and someone says, "Oh, you have access to that? You have that kind of insight?" The government comes along and says, "I'd like you to help me gain a little more insight, actually." So it's scary.
So I'm gonna grab it for a second, because I know we have a question from Ed here, but I also want to do this. All right, I want us to talk about this one. All right, I want you to turn around to your colleagues. And so I know there's a few of you that raised your hands, and we'll come back to that in a second. But I'd like you to turn to your colleagues that are sitting around you, and they've just presented kind of the range here. So we had a little bit of a debate. We had a little difference of opinions. So turn around, talk to your colleagues, and let's just, I want to get a read for the energy in the room on this topic. So take about 5 minutes, if you will. I'm watching time. Okay. Okay. This is a very underground topic. All right? There's not a yes or no, a right or wrong discussion, or necessarily a point. What we're doing here is challenging all of us to look at our duty of care. And it's just from my perspective, it's very similar to, hey, we give great service, but then we never check our service levels, right? Hey, we're going to do member well-being, but we don't necessarily dig in. So that's what we want, is future conversations about it. I'm going to allow, like, if you will, not allow, if I'm going to ask, I know that we have one question right here, and then we'll go to Brett. I'll come back to you. And then we're going to keep the pace moving.
Hi, my name's Megan. I'm from West Star Credit Union here in Las Vegas. Actually, all of our membership base are casino employees. So I feel what you're saying when all of our transactions, we can't assume things. My question is, I actually used to work for QSO, and so I worked with a lot of credit unions of various sizes across the country. And one of the credit unions in Michigan, I won't mention names, but they decided that they were going to kind of get ahead of some of this stuff, and they made a blanket statement for their entire membership where they would not allow any of their cards to allow online gambling transactions at all. So anytime you try to use that credit union's debit card or credit card, it would deny the transaction. What are your opinions on, making that blanket statement and trying to control your members, what they get
You're going to talk
do?
about this tomorrow, actually. I think it's on the topic, which is, yeah.
They are like 500 million.
And we tomorrow. So can we wait for that answer?
Not
'Cause I
just
think-
that, but like, what about all kinds of other things that we deem not to be in our moral wheelhouse that we decide we're going to keep our cards from being used because we're not going to facilitate that behavior, right? That's not illegal.
The general issue is what I was just talking to Raj about, was that who do we want to be as a society, as an American society? That's what it ends up being, without talking too much about the topic. Because if we're looking for certain securities or safeties, that absolutely makes sense. But that's not what our society is.
Yeah, so if you're, we are a free society, right? Hey, I need to be able to do sports betting. Why would you want to stop me from doing that? I consider myself a responsible gambler, right? So if I was a member, you would have lost me. If you would have stopped me from doing that, you would have lost me. As simple as that, right? So again, data analytics, data science, predictive analytics, it's all about identifying risky behavior, right?
It goes beyond it, though, right? Because I know we're just previewing into this. Like, we have a customer of ours, a credit union, who is a software customer of ours, where we help them. I won't say the name of it, but they're nationwide. An Alabama credit union is the back end for financing firearm sales, right? Huge, hunting and sporting kind of community all across the country, right? Well, there's people that obviously politically have a real problem with that, think that we should have gun control. Well, we could go take a stance and say, even though it's not illegal, we're not going to allow shopping at firearms dealers with our cards, right? We could take a stand on that. So I think that's the question you get into, is legality versus morality. Is everything that is immoral, should it be illegal? And that's a whole other question in and of itself. But then the question is, what is our job whenever we determine that? Now, you could say, look, we looked at the numbers, like in your particular use case, we looked at the numbers and, oh my gosh, the amount of chargebacks we get because of sports gambling, we're just taking huge losses off of it, so we just cannot continue to support it, or without certain limits or something. That's a little different thing. But I've heard conversations of credit union executives and boards and things, especially when it came around crypto, saying, well, we think that's just really speculative and that's really risky, and so we're not going to be in the business of facilitating that. And I'm like, okay, but they can go down and they swipe their card down here. I'm like, you understand the stock market, every tech stock's like 75% down in the last, but they were complaining that crypto was down 50. But the point is, that's when they start kind of being at a bit of a nanny state in terms of, well, we get to decide what's best for you, right? That's a really, really slippery slope.
Hi, I really appreciate this discussion taking place within the credit union space, because the first time I heard of credit unions tackling domestic violence was in the legal space. I'm an attorney by trade, and in 2020, the American Bar Association had a seminar, a Zoom, if you will, talking about how credit unions are tackling domestic violence. And my eyes were like, "What are you talking about?" Like, I didn't know we were tackling domestic violence. Like, and so I tuned in, and to my surprise, I learned that there are credit unions in New Mexico that started a QSO. And that QSO partners with a domestic violence community partner where they help women, predominantly, mothers, and they have children, and they help them to get on their feet, going through domestic violence situations. And I thought that's such a creative way, to help domestic violence victims, and also a way that we can easily engage, because we know about QSOs, and we start QSOs, we have QSOs, we work with QSOs, so why not? So it doesn't have to be a very high level approach. We don't have to be lobbying, and it certainly is great to do all those things, but you don't have to feel like, if I'm not doing that, then I can't do something else. And so I encourage you to, I think one of the credit unions was US Eagle. Yeah. Yeah, so, people know about it. So definitely, if you want to get involved in that level, and I thought, why not? We could do that perhaps in every state, at least, have at least one QSO trying to help tackle domestic violence, but certainly working with our community partners.
That's excellent. So it's called Sea of Soul, Marcia Majors in New Mexico. Great place. Let's see. Here we go, Brett.
So Brett Martinez, Redwood Credit Union. First of all, I think there is a fine line here somewhere. We'd spend 2 days trying to figure out where that fine line is. What Todd said about legislation got me thinking. So CRA, we don't have CRA, but I'm pretty sure everybody in the room is doing things in their community, and there's a reason we don't have CRA laws, is because that's what we do as credit unions. And I think that this is what we should, it's more of a plea to our industry. We're not using data to go out and identify people, but those people are in our face every single day. And this area in our credit union is centralized in our fraud. It's not all fraud, but these people are ex-law enforcement. They think like this. They know the trends that are going on. They're educating the rest of the staff. To be honest with you, the one that we have some of the biggest issues with is the one that is legislated, which is elder abuse. You get that. You have to check this box, this box, this box. You have to get some third party involved. You mess that up, you got some people that are pretty pissed off at you at the end of the day. So I just encourage us to, maybe there will be legislation, but we don't need legislation. Find a place in your organization where they're responsible, they're watching the trends, law enforcement people, this is the way they think, and I think that's one of the reasons we're strong. This last conversation about deciding what's good for people, I think the only thing, it got me thinking, the one thing that we don't do is, you get free ATMs with us, we'll reimburse you, except for in casinos and strip clubs, so I guess we are deciding what's good for people.
Okay, one more, and then we're going to wrap.
I like what Stacey was saying, and sorry, Damiana Alarcón from Travis Credit Union. But for us to think outside the box with data and the intersectionality with what we do with it, you could just create a double blind, make sure that it seems like if we have the data and we know the issues, but we don't actually know the specified member, if we have a team just say, hey, these are the top 10 issues that might be happening with financial insecurity for the credit union, and then build an opt-in program. Build something that says, hey, help us fight financial insecurity. Would you like to opt into this kind of education? And obviously target adults, not the youth and the minors, but on and on. Use the data. Don't make it specified. Don't reach out to targeted members. Don't try to involve the nanny state and the FBI and go that far, because it's not good for our reputation. It's not good for our business, and we'll be out of the credit industry really quick. But on the other side, we do know it is happening, and to ask ourselves to think outside the box with what we can do, and then ask people to opt into it when we do create that program. I think that's a possibility.
You started something like that,
Yeah.
and then you just, I love that idea, and you had it just kind of automated, just like a lot of the content stuff that's there, right? It's just looking at the data, and it's just in serving that up when it sees particular patterns. And then you just kind of watch it and see, do you have people proactively reach out and say, hey, I happen to see this, and I really am interested. Then you'd probably learn a bit more about that and even be able to talk to those people and find out, like, should we have reached out more proactively or whatever? So I just think it's one thing where you don't have to decide. It's not like this binary thing. Either we're going to care or we're not going to care. I think it's more of like, well, let's see if there's some unintrusive ways where we don't cross these certain lines to get a little more involved. Then let's play it by ear from there and see where it goes.
That's basically That's basically what we use segment for, actually, because it's aggregate data first. You take a look at behaviors, then you start digging down into it. So keeping track of it, that's a good way to keep track, just to say, okay, on a monthly basis, let's look at this segment that we carved out from segment, literally, and see if behaviors have shifted.
Okay, so we're going to wrap this topic, but you're going to all stick around, right? And be available to people to talk more about it? Okay, tell them thank you, all right?